There are stories that remain suspended between truth and myth, locked in the cold desert winds of Nevada, where secrecy is not the exception, it is to rule. Today, we dive into one of the most controversial and deeply unsettling testimonies in the history of hidden military programs. A testimony that has survived decades of scrutiny, attacks, character, assassinations, and investigations, yet refuses to die. This is not fiction. This is not rumor. This is the documented account of a man who claimed he walked into a restricted base beneath a mountain, where he touched technology humanity was never meant to understand. His name is Bob Lazar. And according to him, his job was simple: reverse engineer a craft not built by human hands. The United States government denies everything. His records are missing. His credentials were wiped. And still there are details he gave in the 1980s that would only be proven true decades later. Today, you will hear his story in full. His memories, his warnings, and the strange and chilling events that followed after he decided to reveal what he saw in a place called a facility even more secretive than Area 51 itself. Welcome to Dark Curiosity Hub. Let's begin. The desert around Groom Lake is a strange kind of quiet silence, so absolute that even the wind feels artificial. It was through this muted landscape that a young physicist named Robert Scott Lazar, then in his late 20s, would drive alone at night, heading toward a destination that was never written on paper, never spoken aloud, and never officially acknowledged. Long before his name was tied to extraterrestrials or secret programs, Lazar was just a man obsessed with physics and propulsion. He built engines in his garage, modified cars until they practically shook themselves apart, and worked odd technical jobs for labs that handled classified projects. He wasn't famous, and he certainly wasn't rich. He was simply brilliant and restless. According to Lazar, it all began when a former contact from Los Alamos recommended him for a special assignment. To be considered, he was told to meet government officials at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas. When he arrived, men in dark suits escorted him into a small room, performed a brief interview, and then immediately began something Lazar didn't expect. A security clearance process more invasive than anything he had ever experienced. They asked about his finances, his relationships, his psychological profile. They even questioned him about arguments he'd had with his wife. Nothing was off-limit, but the real moment of no return came during the polygraph phase, when the interviewer leaned forward and asked a question that struck Lazar like a slap. "Have you ever come into contact with non-human technology?" Lazar hesitated. He laughed, nervously. He thought it was a trick. But the interviewer didn't blink. He simply waited. Something in that moment told Lazar that the job he was being evaluated for was not a regular physics position. Whatever they were testing him for, it was far beyond anything he had imagined. A few days later, he received the call. He was in. His contract did not say S4. It didn't even say Area 51. It simply contained a location and a time and instructions. Drive to EG&G Special Projects at McCarran Airport. Arrive at night. Park in the back lot. Do not speak to anyone. When Lazar arrived, a small, unmarked plane awaited him. He boarded with a handful of silent passengersmen who carried no briefcases, no personal items, and no expression on their faces. The plane took off, flying north, straight into restricted desert airspace. When it landed, Lazar looked out the window and saw the unmistakable dry lake bed of Groom Lake, home to the legendary and officially non-existent Area 51. And yet, as he quickly discovered, Area 51 wasn't his destination. Minutes later, he was placed into a bus with blacked-out windows. The drive was long, winding, and underground at points. And when the doors finally opened, Lazar stepped into a massive hangar carved into the side of a mountain. A sign on the wall said only S4. What he saw inside would change the rest of his life. The first time Lazar saw the craft, he was ante supposed to. That night, as he walked through the hangar toward a briefing room, a heavy door had been left slightly open, just a few inches, just enough to reveal something impossible inside. A metallic curve, smooth and flawless, like liquid frozen in the shape of a disc. He slowed his pace, turned his head. There, sitting silently under floodlights, was a flying saucer. Not a model, not a mock-up. A machine. Lazar would later say that in that first moment, he felt two conflicting emotions crash into one another: awe and dread. Awe because the craft looked like nothing humans had ever built. Dread because he instantly realized where he was and what he had just seen. This was not aerospace research. This was not weapons testing. This was technology from somewhere else. Over the next weeks, Lazar learned more than he expected and less than he hoped. S4 was compartmentalized to a brutal degree. No one knew the full picture. Teams worked in isolated units, kept deliberately ignorant of the other team's findings. Scientists were treated like replaceable parts, but Lazar did catch glimpses. Inside S4 were 9 separate craft, each housed in its own hangar. Each slightly different if they came from different origins or different eras. Some looked smooth and organic. Others had sharp angles, cold geometries, and metallic plates that shimmered strangely under light. The craft Lazar was assigned to study was later referred to as the sport model, because its design was compact and aerodynamic compared to the others. When he touched its surface, he expected it to feel like metal, but instead, it felt different, something smoother, denser, almost like a stone polished by millennia. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no weld marks. It was grown, not built. He was told, bluntly, what his job was: reverse engineer the propulsion system. The first time he saw the craft activate, he felt the air itself shift. A distortion, like heat waves rising from desert sand, rippled underneath the craft, bending the light around it, and then it lifted, silent, motionless. Defying every law, Lazar understood. The secret, he was told, was something called Element 115, a substance it, at the time, did not exist on Earth. When used correctly, it generated its own gravitational field and bent the space around the craft. It didn't fly, it fell into the distortion it created. But the most disturbing moment happened when Lazar read the briefing documents assigned to him. Documents that suggested without question that the craft was not human in origin, and that S4 scientists had been studying these machines since at least the 1970s, possibly earlier. Lazar was warned never to repeat anything he saw, yet someone had seen him. Someone was taking note, and soon the government's surveillance of his life would grow unbearable. But before things collapsed, something strange and unexpected happened, something that pushed him toward revealing the truth. Late one night, he brought 2 civilian friends to the desert edge near Groom Lake to watch a test flight, and what they filmed would change everything. In the winter of 1989, the Nevada desert was cold enough to burn. Wind rolled across the empty landscape in cold sheets, whispering through the scrub brush and rattling the loose stones scattered across the valley floor. It was on one of those nights dark, silent, and bone-cold that Bob Lazar made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He had reached a breaking point. His work at S4 had become increasingly restrictive. Security officers followed him closely, scrutinizing his behavior. He began to notice black cars parked on roads near his home, men sitting silently inside them. His phone line crackled with strange clicks. Every move he made felt monitored. Then came the psychological interview, soon expected summons to be questioned about his personal life, his marriage, his finances. The questions became accusatory, invasive, suffocating. Lazar knew the pattern. They were preparing to remove him. His instincts told him that soon he would no longer be allowed near S, and perhaps would not be allowed to speak freely again. So he did something reckless, something that still shocks investigators even today. He decided to prove what he had seen. Now that's 4 conducted flight tests on Wednesday nights after 9 p.m. The program followed a strict cycle, choosing midweek because civilians were least likely to be out wandering the desert, and he knew exactly where the glowing craft performed their maneuvers: the southern edge of Papoose Lake. So Lazar gathered 2 friends, Jean Huff and John Lorand, drove them deep into the desert, down a series of narrow dirt roads illuminated only by the headlights of his car. They stopped near a ridge, overlooking restricted airspace. The desert stretched out before them flat, black, and eternal. The only sound was the wind scraping across the hard-packed earth. Then, just after 9:15 p.m., it happened. A sphere of pale bluish light rose from behind the mountains. At first, it hovered like a star, trembling just above the ridge. Then it moved, not smoothly like a plane, not floating like a helicopter. It jerked, jumping upward, sideways, downward, with shocking acceleration. It made right-angle turns, instant velocity shifts, movements impossible for any aircraft known to humans. Jean whispered, "That shouldn't be able to move like that." John, who had seen classified aircraft before, was speechless. But the most unsettling part was the silence. The craft produced no sound, no engine rumble, not even the faint vibration of disturbed air. It was as though it wasn't flying, only appearing in one place after another, skipping through gravity like stones across water. Lazar said quietly, "That's it. That's the gravity wave system." They filmed the object on a camcorder, grainy, shaky footage, but enough to capture the impossible motion, enough to prove that Lazar wasn't simply making up stories. For the next 2 weeks, the group returned again, always on Wednesday nights. Always around the same time, and X time the lights appeared, dancing across the sky with mechanical precision. But on the third night, something changed. As the craft vanished beyond the ridge, the desert went unnaturally still. The wind fell away, like a breath being held. A faint vibration tremored through the sand beneath their feet, too subtle to identify. And then, from the darkness behind them, the sharp white beam of a flashlight snapped on. "Stop! Hands where we can see them." The group froze. Security agents, armed and furious, surrounded them. They had been discovered. It was the moment Bob Lazar realized that the government had been watching him far more closely than he ever imagined. After the encounter in the desert, Lazar's life unraveled with terrifying precision. The very next morning, he received a phone call instructing him to report to EG&G immediately. His stomach churned with dread as he drove through the desert, headlights cutting through the early light. He knew something irreversible was coming. When he arrived, security personnel escorted him into a small, windowless room. No greeting, no explanation, no attempt to hide their anger. On the table were photographs, grainy, long-distance shots of Lazar and his friends in the desert. In some images, Lazar could be seen pointing toward the sky. In others, the faint smudge of the test craft glowed in the distance. The interrogator slammed the table. "What you did compromised a classified government operation. Do you understand the magnitude of your violation?" Lazar didn't answer. He knew the truth. They had been watching him long before he ever brought his friends. They had deliberately allowed the situation to escalate so they could confront him with this level of force. The interrogator leaned in, voice low and threatening. "You tell anyone what you've seen. Anyone you've ever told anything so far, we will make sure your life goes in a direction you do not want. This is the last warning you will receive. After today, we will not speak again." Then came the final blow. "You are no longer cleared for S4. Your involvement ends now." Lazar left the building shaken, but the nightmare was only beginning. Te era sure. Days later, Lazar attempted something normal, something human, to regain a sense of stability. He called Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he had previously worked as a contractor in the physics department, in hopes of retrieving employment records. The lab told him he had never worked there, not as an engineer, not as a technician, not in any capacity. But Lazar remembered the security badges. He remembered his office. He remembered working on particle accelerators and being photographed for the local newspaper. Yet according to official documentation, he did not exist. Then he contacted MIT to request transcripts from his supposed master's degree in physics. They had no record of him, no application, no attendance, nothing. The university where he claimed to have earned his bachelor's degree also had no record. Piece by piece, his past was disappearing. His academic history, his professional history, his identity as a scientist. When reporters later pressed him on these inconsistencies, Lazar admitted the horrifying truth. "I can't prove I'm qualified for the job I had, because the places that trained me are pretending. I was never there. Investigative journalists would later uncover strong indication, not absolute proof, that his records had intentionally been removed. Former colleagues at Los Alamos recognized him, confirming his presence there. A local newspaper from the early 1980s featured a photograph of Lazar standing next to a particle accelerator, impossible if he had never worked at the lab. Yet officially, he had been erased. And then came the surveillance. Vehicles parked outside his home with men who never exited the car. Phone calls with breathing but no voice. Footsteps outside his house at night. Unexpected knocks at the door, always followed by silence, and a growing sense that someone was waiting for him to make the wrong move. Lazar became paranoid, but it wasn't paranoia if it was true. He began sleeping with a firearm nearby. He stopped using the same route to work twice. He spoke less, trusted less, stayed home more, and in that pressure cooker of fear, isolation, and erasure, he reached a conclusion. If they were going to silence him permanently, then he had one final option: tell the world before they could shut him down. He contacted a journalist, and with that decision, the story of S4 exploded into public view. In May of 1989, inside a dimly lit Las Vegas newsroom, a man wearing large dark glasses and a simple gray jacket sat quietly in front of a camera. His real name was concealed. He was introduced only as Dennis, but those who knew him recognized the voice. Bob Lazar was about to reveal everything. The interviewer, investigative reporter George Knapp, had spent years digging into government secrecy, corruption, and unexplained aerial phenomena. But nothing had prepared him for what Lazar was about to say on live television. The recording began. Lazar spoke slowly, almost clinically, as if recounting the memories of someone else. He described the base called S4, carved into a mountain near Papoose Lake. He outlined the 9 craft stored in its hangars. He explained the propulsion system, a reactor powered by element 115, generating its own gravitational field. He described their movements, their structure, even the interior layout of the craft. As said openly, this technology is not ours. It was not made by human hands. Viewers across Nevada sat frozen in disbelief. The newsroom itself fell silent, the crew hypnotized by the calm certainty in Lazar's words. Knapp asked skeptically, "If this is true, why are you telling us now?" Lazar exhaled, voice trembling for the first time, "Because identities think they're going to let me live much longer." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. That night, the broadcast spread like wildfire. Within hours, news vans crowded outside Lazar's home. People drove into the desert hoping to see test flights. Photographs of strange lights began circulating. Former military employees contacted Knapp anonymously, hinting that Lazar's claims were far closer to the truth than anyone realized. But along with attention came consequences. Government vehicles continued stalking Lazar. His home was raided under the pretext of chemical irregularities. Friends distanced themselves. He became unemployable in scientific fields. His reputation became a battleground between believers and skeptics. And yet, despite all attempts to discredit him, none of his story could be fully disproven. Years passed. More whistleblowers emerged. Some claimed they had worked near S4. Others described seeing unidentifiable craft in that same region. In the 2000s, researchers analyzing Lazar's claims noted something chilling. Element 115, dismissed as impossible in 1989, was successfully synthesized by Russian physicists in 2003. Behaved exactly as Lazar had described. Lazar himself never profited from his claims. He never sought fame. Instead, he retreated from public life, opening a small scientific supply business and avoiding interviews for decades. But every so often, when the desert winds shift and the night sky above Nevada flickers with lights that cannot be identified, his name resurfaces. And people remember the man who said he worked in a hidden base beneath a mountain, who touched technology from somewhere else, and who risked everything to tell the world what he saw. S4 remains officially non-existent. The government denies everything, and the truth remains locked behind desert mountains and black budget corridos. But the echoes of Lazar's testimony still ripple through history. a quiet warning, a whispered secret, a riddle buried beneath Groom Lake. Perhaps the question is no longer whether Bob Lazar told the truth, but whether humanity is ready for the answer. Whether you believe Bob Lazar or not, one fact remains unshakable. His story changed the landscape of modern mystery. It opened a doorway into a world of hidden programs, untraceable budgets, and technology that may sit beyond the boundaries of human invention. Tonight, you followed his footsteps through desert hangars, silent craft, erased records, and the interview that shook the world. What lies beneath the sands of Nevada is still unknown, but the shadows cast by Lazar's testimony remain long and unsettling. Tell us in the comments a topic you're curious about and want to know more about.